In this video, we're going to use cold hard data to win more games of limited Magic. The current set is Brothers War, but all of the tips I'll share in this video should be relevant regardless of the set you want to draft. So for using data to win more games of Magic, where does this data come from? 17lands.com. This is a free tracker that runs in the background while you draft and play games of limited Magic on Arena. It then grabs all of this data from all of the players using it and compiles it into one easy to access place. And quick side note, you actually don't need to use the tracker to access the data. It's freely available to everyone. I'm going to teach you how to use 17 lands and how to get the most out of the data that's available to you. My suggestion is to have a few drafts under your belt before you dive into the data. You really want to start to understand how the cards do interact with each other and have a rough idea of the archetypes, what is good and not good. Really what we're using data for is to kind of refine our opinions, maybe challenge them or confirm some of the suspicions that we have about cards. Data is incredible, but it's not everything. So let's go ahead and start by actually opening up 17lands.com. So everything we're going to access in this video is going to be under the Analytics tab. So after going to 17lands.com, you're going to click the drop down for Analytics, and we're going to start with Color Performance. So now that we're here on the Color Performance tab, what we want to look at is a couple of things. So first, obviously, it's showing you the color, number of wins versus number of games, and then the win rate. So it's just wins into the number of games. So what we're looking at here is the all decks win rate is actually 55.5%. The average player on 17 lands is better than the average Magic player overall. So the baseline is actually 55.5% that we're looking at. So that's the baseline. Anything above 55.5% is a good or strong archetype. It's winning more than average. If it's below 55.5%, it's a below average archetype. So what we can start to do here is get a sense of what types of decks are doing well. So again, the monocolor decks are actually doing really well overall. And we can break that down a little further, see that mono white is the strongest monocolor deck. Mono black is okay, and mono blue is something you maybe want to avoid. Two color is the best overall though. So we can see looking at this 55.9% win rate, you get a slight edge by playing a two color deck. And then what's interesting is as we continue to go down this list, you lose a little bit of win equity every color you add and every splash you add in this set. One pitfall you want to avoid while looking into the data is the sample size. So recall back to your high school statistics class, if the sample size is too small, it's not a data point we can necessarily trust. So the five color decks, they have a 57.1% win rate. It's pretty good, but only 28 games total have been played with five color decks. A five color deck is probably something we want to avoid unless you want to just meme. So looking at this data, we can start to see that two color decks is really where we want to end up. So actually the best win rate archetype in Brothers War is Boros, red-white at 58.4% win rate. Second is White Blue, 57.7%. Then it's Izzet at 57%, and then Gruul at 56.6%. The only archetype it looks like we'd want to avoid is Green Blue. 52.5% win rate. You lose a ton of win equity if you end up in Green Blue. So that looks like the one archetype we'd actually want to bias against. And then again, we lose win equity as we add colors. So we really are incentivized to play two colors. Now, if we want to change anything here, we could change the draft type. I always just default to Premier Draft, and then we can change the set. I always leave the date range alone, just to make sure it covers the whole set. So let's switch to Dominaria United. And what's interesting here, let's see what the default win rate is. So 56.5% win rate in Dominaria United. So anything below 56.5 is below the baseline. So monocolor and a splash is good, but rare. That only 3,200 games were played. Two color is still the best. So at 58.5% win rate, you get 2 percentage points above the average by playing a two color deck in Dominaria United, with the best archetype again being red-white. So red-white decks are pretty good, I guess. But what you'll notice is with Dominaria United, you do lose a little bit of win percentage, but you're still above average at 2 and a splash. But you'll notice that 3 and a splash is actually more than 3, which is interesting. And all the way up to 4 and 5 color, the decks actually do not lose a ton of win equity. If you played some Dominaria United, you'll know that 4 and 5 color decks are definitely viable. They're good, and the data kind of bears that out. So if you hadn't drafted the set before, you could look at this data and see, oh, maybe 4 and 5 color decks are something that's worthwhile, but maybe I should bias towards a clean two color deck if that's available to me. So that's color performance. Next thing we want to look at is the card performance tab. So this is where the meat and potatoes of 17 lands is going to be available. Couple things, the drop down. Again, it's the set, the draft type, users. So there's bottom, middle, and top, and this is based on win rate of the various users on 17 lands. I always just default to all users, but maybe if you have some suspicions, maybe a card's bad, but you think it might be good, go check out how it works with a top level player. That might give you a sense of maybe it's just a card the community is not playing correctly, and maybe you're able to squeeze some extra value out of it. So you could look at how top players are performing with a various card. So we'll change that back to all users. We can change the color. So if we want to look at cards of a particular color, multicolor also includes cards that are single color, but include an off-color kicker cost, like in Dominaria United, or in Brothers War, a card like Clay Champion that's colorless, but has multiple colors of activated or enters the battlefield abilities in that case. So let's leave it as all. Then we could change it by deck type. So if we want to see, maybe how a card performs in white-blue versus blue-black, we could do that. And then we have rarity. So I tend to spend a lot of time with commons, so that's pretty useful, but we could also just leave it set as all. So now we're gonna go through these columns here. So name, color, and rarity, all pretty straightforward. You could hover over this to see the picture. Numbers seen, that's how many times it was seen in a draft. So 157,000 copies of Aeronaut Cavalry have been passed around tables. The ALSA is average last seen at. So the ALSA for Aeronaut Cavalry is 5.2. That means if you really value this card highly, this is around the last time in the pack that you're gonna see it, is around pick 5. So if you're trying to wheel Aeronaut Cavalry, it's probably not gonna happen. This is how many were picked. This is the average taken at. So again, related to the ALSA. So somebody's seeing it at around pick 5, it's being picked around pick 6 or 7. Number of games it was played. This is how many times it was included in the deck, not necessarily drawn or cast, but how many times it was included in the deck. And then what the win rate is when it's in the deck. This is how many opening hands it was in and the opening hand win rate. This is the games drawn and the games drawn win rate. So when you actually draw the card into your hand, how does it perform? Then the game in hand win rate is actually just a combination of these two stats. So opening hand and games drawn. So if at any point in the game the card was in your hand, this is the win rate. And then there's games not seen win rate. So you can see if the card, is maybe in the deck but doesn't have a huge performance on the outcome. A lot of the white cards, for example, are getting a bump in Brothers War because white overall is just pretty good. Then we have the improvement when drawn. So this shows us what the change in the win rate is when you actually draw the card during a game. So Aeronaut Cavalry, you get a 0.6 percentage point increase in your win rate when you draw the card. So pretty good. Now I find it useful to default to the game in hand win rate, since that tends to give the best overall picture of how a card performs in various situations, both in your opening hand and when drawn later in the game. So we could use this, for example, to see what the best rares in the set are. So we'll just sort by game in hand win rate, and in order, the top 5 rares in the set are Titania's Command, Siege Veteran, Gix's Command, Wormcoil Engine, and Cityscape Leveler. You can even see the improvement when drawn is absolutely insane. So you get a 16 percentage point bump when you draw Titania's Command, which is just bananas. So on the flip side, we could look at what the worst cards in a set are. Maybe, you open a rare you've never played with before and you're curious, is this actually something I would want to play with? And if intuition couldn't get you there, we can look at a card like, let's say, Goblin Charbelcher. Very situational, very high variance, 46.3% game in hand win rate. And again, the baseline is not 50%, it's 55.5%. So about 9 percentage point loss in win rate by putting Goblin Charbelcher in your deck. If you're trying to win, probably a card you should not play. So looking at the 3 win rate stats in tandem can give us a picture of how the card performs in different points of the game. A high opening hand win rate with a low games drawn or game in hand win rate gives us the sense that a card is good in aggressive decks and should be avoided in decks that want to play a longer game. And the inverse is also true. Cards with a high games drawn win rate and a low opening hand win rate are better in more controlling decks that want to get to the late game. There are exceptions, and that's when these data points can become interesting, but generally they don't differ a ton between the various win rates. Cards that are good tend to just be good, but it's something to keep in mind. So for example, one of the best commons in the set for opening hand win rate at 59.8% is Goblin Blast Runner. So very, very good in your opening hand. You want to play this in more aggressive decks. And as we can see, the game's drawn win rate is 55.3%. So it is a liability in the late game. Now, if we had just looked at the game in hand win rate, we wouldn't really get a full picture of how the card performs. You can see you actually lose percentage points when you draw it, but it's fantastic in aggressive decks. So the card is good, but situational. So now for a different example, Boulder Branch Golem has an opening hand win rate of 54.8%, so definitely a liability if you draw it early. We want to maybe bias towards a more controlling build. You have a 58.5% win rate when you draw this card later in the game. Now that we have an understanding of the stats at a high level, we can start to understand how powerful cards are just purely in a vacuum. However, we can go one level deeper. Let's sort by deck type. Perhaps you find yourself struggling to win with a particular archetype in a format, or want to go a bit deeper into what makes the deck tick. Let's select blue-red for this example. This would show us how cards performed in decks that were primarily blue-red. this also does include decks that have a splash. A couple examples that I pulled out here. So the first example is Wing Commando. So in blue-red, it actually only has a 55.6% game in hand win rate, which is kind of interesting. That's actually a card that I thought would be really strong in this deck early on. And it's an average playable at best. Not necessarily a card that is a high priority for blue-red. And then next is Urza's Rebuff. So if we just do overall, across all decks, Urza's Rebuff has a 55.1% game in hand win rate. And again, comparing that to the baseline of 55.5%, you lose win equity with Urza's Rebuff. But if we sort by blue-red, we can see Urza's Rebuff goes to 57% game in hand win rate in blue-red. Now a big pitfall to watch out for here is relying on data exclusively. After about picks 4 or 5, really it does come down to context, and make sure that you're drafting the best deck, not just a group of good cards. Synergy is always going to win. So that brings us to the next section. We're going to evaluate recent trophy decks. So let's go ahead and open this up. And let's say we're really struggling to win with blue-green, which is the worst performing archetype in the set, and try to see, okay, if blue-green is the archetype that's open in my seat, and that's what I'm supposed to be drafting, how do I win with that deck? Let me make sure I know what pieces are going to be good there. So let's take a look at blue-green. And what I'm going to do is just take a look at color. I also am looking at the rank. No offense to the bronze and silver players, but I do value those slightly less. Not that you can't learn anything from them, but I do trust the higher rank trophy decks a little bit more. So I'm going to look at this one. So let's just open these up in new tabs. And blue-green. Okay, so we've got a couple of trophy decks for blue-green open here. So now what we're gonna do is we're just gonna flip through the list and see if we can find any trends. So some of the cards that jump out to me as showing up in every list, Blanchwood Prowlers, Sentinel Stalwarts for mana. We've got tons of Weakstone Subjugations and a ton of Boulder Branch Golems. So those seem like pretty key commons for this deck. And although these blue-green decks are slower and a bit more controlling, we actually haven't seen a single copy of Urza's Rebuff, so it sort of confirms what we found earlier, that that's really a card for blue-red, not blue-green. So no single data point should be the deciding factor, but looking at all of this data available to us on 17 lands can give us that little extra edge over our opponents that we're looking for.